Hello! Welcome back to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, joined by my personal professor and my TV dad, Bob Forrant.
Thank you very much for that. I always love that title. Always love that title.
Well,
Good
you
to be
are.
here.
I
Good to be
learned
here.
so much from you. I learned how to learn better from you and how to ask better questions. So we're back on History in Lowell. Last episode, we talked about an education lawsuit, or a lawsuit having to do with education that was brought about by several parents in the community, and this was in the 70s into the 80s.
Yep.
But it actually enacted real change, real lasting change, and it took a little bit of time to see that change happen. Today, we're talking about something similar that occurred in Lowell's more recent history, and it also has contacts in the national landscape, as we tend to do. This one is more about voting rights.
Right.
So, Bob, let's set the scene. Let's actually, I don't know if we want to go further back to the national scene first.
We can go in the Wayback Machine if you want.
Yes.
I mean, we're in the Wayback Machine. We're talking about the lawsuit, which we'll speak about today on the program. The gist of the lawsuit originates actually in the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Yes.
Which are part of the end to the institution of slavery after the Civil War. And the 14th and 15th Amendments essentially guarantee due process, all sorts of important rights and privileges, and also grant citizenship to enslaved people, which is an important part of it. And also in the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. And the right to vote shouldn't be abridged by, I'm trying to think of that word, fancy law word, abridged, that means blocked or stopped, blocked by race and or nationality. And so those are the laws of the land that are going to govern the electoral processes in the United States from the late 1860s when these amendments were ratified forward. We don't always live up to the ideals of those amendments, but nonetheless they're there and there's something to work from.
Yes, and at that time, we know everybody didn't have the right to vote. And even when people were fighting for the right to vote, we had the women's suffrage movement. It wasn't for everybody there either. It was primarily for white women to get the right to vote. And then there were just men getting the right to vote. So I'm thinking of...
So it is abridged.
It is abridged, exactly.
even though it's not supposed to be, it's definitely abridged. And by the late 19th century, it's almost as though there wasn't a civil war in the sense of black people's civil rights in the South are essentially snatched away by the sort of rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, and voting rights are severely limited up into and including in several elections in Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, around Election Day, people being murdered for trying to vote. And so when I'm talking about this with my students, sometimes I'll talk to them about do they vote or not, and why the vote is important. I say, people died to basically try to figure out how to do this. And so when now in your daily, business, you're reading in the newspaper that people are upset because voting rights are being infringed in some way, there's a reason why people are upset. There's this long history, and this history is really a part of the country's history and Lowell's history.
Exactly, and I think of, we're talking about that citizenship, right? Why so many people are so frustrated. They don't understand how the Electoral College works. They don't understand why we even have the Electoral
And I don't
College.
either, and I'm supposed to.
Right. Exactly. And we know that that's another obstruction, right?
Yes.
We do have an episode on it, though, because you did a lot of research.
Yep.
And so people should check that out if you want to learn more about the Electoral
I'll have to
College.
go back and watch it.
Me too. But I see a lot of people, even my age, who are like, oh, I feel like my vote doesn't count, so I'm not going to do it. But for me, I think of how my grandmother was born, so far back in 1938, before she had the right to vote, and how so many people had to lose their lives, like we talked about, and how even children were protesting so that we could have the right to vote, so black folks can have the right to vote, and why the importance of everybody having a fair and free election gets representation,
Right.
right? Because that's what that vote is supposed to mean. It's supposed to be about a fair and free election
Yeah.
and representation for everybody in the democracy.
Right, absolutely. You're not supposed to. It's not supposed to be what we. When this country was founded after the revolution, it seems weird to think. It's like people don't understand that sometimes too. There was a revolution to get us a country, and now we think of revolutions as kind of scary things. But I mean, we're born in a we the United States are born in a revolution, but it's not until 1965.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a Voting Rights Act, and it's at the height of the civil rights movement when people have really been sort of advocating for, pushing again for the right to vote, that finally President Lyndon Johnson puts in motion through Congress, we need a bill, we need something that will, and the point of the federal government doing it is to put above the states oversight of the electoral process, to say there's a federal Voting Rights Act, and the federal government through the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has a right to investigate and look at discrepancies in the way voting is done. And essentially that enshrines, in 65, that enshrines one person, one vote, so to speak. And it's again supposed to, the way the law interprets that is everybody's vote should equally count.
Mm-hmm.
And that eventually gets us to Lowell.
And that eventually gets us to Lowell. And much like the last story that we told on the last episode, it's that road is not without its challenges, it's not without its discrimination, it's not without its vitriol and unfortunate tragedies. And then when we get to Lowell, it is not without its extensively long process.
Yes.
And people looking at the history, right, and seeing, we've got a lot more diversity here, but the local government does not reflect
Doesn't
that.
reflect it, right. And what's interesting is that as people were doing the research for the lawsuit, which gets filed in May of 2017, there's movements back in time into the 1980s, early 1990s, so people trying to do something similar. And the gist of the complaint is that all the elected offices in Lowell, city council, school committee, are elected in the city at large.
Right.
And so the plaintiffs, the people who filed the lawsuit, from the Latino and Asian American communities in the city, essentially, and the black community as well, essentially say that's not what happens, because by electing at large, no matter how much if we all voted 100% for the same two people, they could never win, because the rest of the city would vote at large and would vote for all these other people. And so it's reflected in the lawsuit. They collected data for I think it was maybe the 2013 or 2015 city election. And they found that two Cambodian American candidates were 1 and 2 amongst voters in the neighborhoods where predominantly Cambodian Americans live, but they were 18 and 19. In the ballot for every other part of the city, reflecting the fact that hardly anybody who wasn't Cambodian American would vote for those candidates. And so that became, in part, the basis for the lawsuit, that in effect, that vote doesn't count, that you can go and you can vote and you can never win.
Yeah.
And so essentially that's what the federal government was supposed to protect. And so now that becomes the germination of people thinking, okay, what do we do?
And then these people, much like the parents got together, they said, we have to do something, and we need to change. We need to make a change. We need this change yesterday. We need to look at how the city is shaped, right? And they looked at the districts. They looked at all of these different options of what they could actually bring. And then they ended up saying, all right, we're going to sue the city. Right.
Right.
That's the gist of it, the long and short of it.
Yeah, in effect. And because as again, people working for a long time on this, basically made the point that if you don't have, and also should add that the city demographically is changing dramatically.
Right.
And
Especially
so
at
the
this
city
time.
is becoming, and I hate the term, but becoming majority minority,
Yeah.
which it now is. And when the lawsuit's filed, the census sort of looked, it's like maybe 51, 49 white, non-white, right? And it's sort of, it's probably the other way around because a lot of people just weren't counted or whatever, who the heck knows? But it's close enough that the fact that historically the city council and the school committee had always been white, well, it's not reflective of what again, if you assume people vote, you know, in a fair way and not in a discriminatory way, and not vote for their, as my grandparents would say, you vote for your kind. And you know, I mean, I don't know what they thought when they were saying it. I can imagine. But when you hear that, you stick with your kind. It's kind of like I want to cringe a bit.
Yeah.
And so and it matters because, and they make the point in the lawsuit, because you could be listening now and thinking, well, what difference would it really make? The difference it makes is that in terms of the power of the school committee and the power of the city council, they then get to make decisions that affect the entire city. And if you live in the city, but your voice is never heard or hardly ever heard, then how are your issues represented, and and so it's one thing to say, well, you know, you can sign up and you can talk. There's a difference between signing up and talking and voting.
Exactly.
And sitting in a city council and there's a motion in front of you. I can go and speak on the motion, which I've done, you know, on numerous occasions, but I can't vote.
Exactly.
I've already voted for the people to represent me. And the same way with the schools, and also as well with hiring. Because one of the big sort of issues I think that still is problematic in the city, and I believe they're working on it, but it's not quick enough, I don't think, in my humble opinion. Like, who gets hired to run the schools, for example?
Yes.
How's the leadership of the schools? How are teachers hired? How does all that happen? The same way in the city, when it hires people for managerial level positions and whatnot, who gets to decide how is that done? And so if you can't vote, if your vote doesn't actually add up to anything, then, right, because this was the argument people made trying to get votes back in the early 20th century and saying, well, if we can't register to vote, we can't, so this isn't a question of registration, but back then it was. If we can't register to vote, it means we can't sit on a jury. If we can't sit on a jury, that means this stuff in the Constitution about a jury of your peers and all that. Like, no. And so you get all these cases in the South where it's known that somebody murdered a black person trying to vote, and everybody knows who did it, but the person after an hour and a half of jury deliberation is let go. And it's partly because there's nobody there, right, sort of taking the side of the victim in that particular situation. And so it's the same. And so the lawsuit is really framed that way. The other thing that's interesting is, because I was helping do research when this was being sort of assembled, is Lowell is one of the last cities in Massachusetts to still be electing at large while this is going on. Other cities, Boston changes like in the 70s or early 80s, I believe. Other places, we're one of the holdouts that has not gone to either completely districts or some hybrid combination of district and at large. And so, and also there have been several Supreme Court cases that have ruled against communities that have these setups and saying they violate one person, one vote. They violate the Constitution. And so when people intimated the lawsuit, the city should have done the right thing and said, okay, let's settle it.
But that's not what they did.
But that's not what they did. And all the law was against them, all the historical precedents were against them, all the other communities in the state were changing but them. And similar to the schools stuff that we talked about before, basically they dug their heels in and essentially said the community's not going to tell us what to do.
This is like, it always blows my mind when especially when we frame it in a constitutional context. Because, like I always say, whatever's happening on the national stage, you can bet that it's either happened or is happening or will happen in Lowell. And Lowell has it's a special place where community can make things happen. But that power structure really seems to reflect sometimes the worst power that we've seen across the board.
Yep. Yeah, and it fits the. It's interesting because if you look at like city elections in the past, so before this is happening, you look at the demographics of Lowell, where you have these successive waves of immigrants. One of the ways that the older group tries to hang on to power is to cling to those electoral positions and make it really hard for somebody else to get in. And so if you're if you're trying to hold on, and so Lowell isn't always sort of at large. It becomes at large. I'm pretty sure I remember talking to Dick Howe about this. I think it changes like in the early 1950s. But that makes sense because the city's very contentious then with sort of the second generation of French Canadian and Greeks and third generation of Irish. People are trying to hold on to their turf and their space.
Yeah.
But Boston, looking at my notes, Boston goes to districts in 1981. Springfield hangs on for a while, but they change in the early 2000s. In several states, I was trying to find my list. I was surprised that some of them were southern states. Several states do away with it and say there has to be, some. Oh yeah, here. Voting rights activists forced communities in Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Montana, and New York to drop at-large only elections.
Wow.
Before this came in Lowell. And again, people didn't want a lawsuit. People wanted to settle it.
Yeah.
But then they had to. And then when they introduced the lawsuit in 2017, they introduced it in May. The city didn't respond right away. It took until September, October of 2017. And then their next move was to go to federal court and try to get the case thrown out.
Oh, but you're going to federal court. And so there's got to be some kind of constitutional precedent when you take it to federal court. Did they not realize it was going to work against them?
Yeah, well, again, that's the thing, right? That all of this is the lawsuit is couched in federal law.
Yeah.
It's the federal court, the same as in the school case, and you can't walk around that.
Exactly.
It's there and it's clear. And again, there have been all of these other cases and all of these other rulings, and so anybody that sort of would know you can't to the city council and the various city managers that were involved over the years as this dragged itself out. You're not going to win, and what you're doing, you're postponing the inevitable, but at the same time you're doubling down on the voting rights violations.
Yeah.
By not saying yes, you're right, we should have fixed this 20 years ago. Not, yeah, no, throw it out. They don't have any standing, or they don't have a basis in law.
This all gives me a headache, Bob.
Yeah.
Why dig your heels in? I mean, I understand because power wants to cling to power, like we just said. And when you look at the lawsuit too, I think they talk about which district historically has overrepresentation on the city council. And it's often the district that has the most money is the whitest, and it's held on to power for the longest.
Right.
So if things start to shift, they know that it's not going to be in their personal interest anymore.
Right. And generally speaking, the neighborhood that most benefited from this setup was Belvedere.
Yep.
But it also benefited and served the interests of sort of the various large political families in Lowell, and now don't lightning strike me, that have extended families. And like if you're a newcomer to Lowell, and as the population is changing, trying to figure out how to campaign and win in an entire city is extraordinarily difficult. And added on to that, this is interesting, like I was thinking about the irony of this as I was thinking about the show. Like historically, as the population changed, people ended up being isolated in 2 or 3 neighborhoods in the city, right? Like parts of the Highlands, parts of back central, parts of the Acre, right? Um, and now, and so then that also made it difficult to sort of figure out how do you create a network of people to vote for you or work for your campaign, or like,
Right.
well, you know, door knock in Centerville, like where I live, or door knock in Belvedere, or the Highlands, or wherever. So it's hard to build that campaign, but building it in your neighborhood could conceivably be a bit easier. It would be an easier bite to chew than trying to, you know, take on all of the history of Lowell. And so then when the suit starts percolating, one of the arguments is that at a minimum, the city needs to redraw the voting districts so that at least one district is majority minority, so that it's possible for somebody to win. And what it does is it sort of reintroduces the idea of how segregated the city was historically, which some people don't want to admit.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we've had these discussions at the city council where we're
Right.
not a segregated city. Well, yeah, if you drive around with your eyes open, come on now.
Yeah.
Um, right? And so it still works that way. And so now, like the settlement, that's what people wanted. They wanted these smaller chunks of the city so that you would have 8, 9, whatever, however many it ended up being, districts that people could campaign in, and they would be more walkable. It would be easier to door knock them. It would be easier to get a campaign group to do the necessary work as opposed to trying to run citywide. And yeah, I mean, but again, it's 2017. The city basically first move, throw it out of court. The courts laugh at the city. Yeah, no, we're not doing that. It's not settled. It doesn't, nothing happens, nothing changes until the 2021 election.
Yeah.
So 3 election cycles, 2017, 19, 21, before it actually gets changed. And people have been trying to get it changed from the early 2000s.
So another lawsuit that we see that's been going on for decades at this point, and it takes so long for
Yep.
any change to be made. And the other part of that is it also makes it more accessible for people in their local communities to run, right? Like, because these folks probably don't have just stacks of money to be able to do a campaign, like what you're
Yep.
talking about, being able to make it more local. So in 2021, we're still in the midst of the pandemic. Things are finally maybe like starting to open again, but we have to figure out how we're going to do this, right? So the lawsuit gets settled, and they do decide on hybrid. It's an at-large. We have 3 at-large, and the rest are district seats.
Right.
Right.
8 districts and 3 at large.
So it's kind of a successful lawsuit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what happened was the plaintiffs, the community coalition, finally the city said, okay, we want to settle. And once it's in the courts, a federal judge has to sign off on a consent decree.
Right.
The city just can't say, yeah, okay. And then like we do something, and then, because the city actually, after this was settled, tried to like change it again. But that's a story for another day. But so they essentially came back to the community with 2 possibilities. One would be everybody by district, nobody at large. And the other one would be a hybrid, where there would be like some combination, 9 and 3, 9 and 2, 9, 8 and 3, whatever it would be, whatever the city figured out. And they would have to like look at a map and where people live and try to think about how to change slightly the vote, the districts where people voted and all. And the same with the school committee. And with the school committee, they basically, ultimately the decision was 8 districts and 3 for the city council, as you said. And then they combined the 8 districts into 4. They reduced the number for the school committee, 4 and 2 at large and the mayor. And that's how that worked. And so then 2021 was the first election cycle where that basically that configuration was how people were voting. And things changed. And so when you look at the council and the school committee and you add them all together and then look at the composition of both together, about 35% of everybody on the council and the school committee was a person of color. And so that people thought of as at least better, way better than 100% not. Or 20% not. I mean, by that point, there had been people from the Cambodian American community elected to the council, but there had been no Latinos elected. There still haven't been. There hadn't been any black people elected either. But I think somebody was elected to the school committee, right?
Yep, we had Stacey Thompson.
But then she lost in the next election, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was 2021. That was the first time a black person had been elected to office in Lowell.
That's so crazy.
2021.
I don't think that we even really celebrated that properly, but which we will have to eventually. And I can't believe that it's coming up on time to wrap.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I know. I feel like we're just getting into the real good meat of this, but this is just yet again another example of Lowellians coming together, seeing that there's a big issue, and banding together to fix that issue, regardless of what the powers that be say. And it's only 2024. We're going into 2025, another election year, and this kind of big change, there are bound to be lasting effects. But in order for us to see actual change over the long run, people need to understand it takes time. It also takes for the city to do more to inform the public about the changes, where your new polling location might be, because it's district. Who is your district representative? What are you actually voting for? And we do have really great organizations like Lowell Votes that's out there that helps to get the word out about the candidates. But I think the city could be doing more. Yep,
and we need to. I mean, the only way this really has any lasting impact, to your point, is that more people need to run.
Yes.
And so there needs to be, we need and I know like the Coalition for a Better Acre does some of this as well, but we need more. This is a place the university could help, and it essentially doesn't. Shame on them. My boss, sorry. Do some like boot camps for anybody that wants to run for office. Because ultimately, that's what it's going to take. Otherwise, the structure has changed, but in many respects, a lot of the same people in the first and second elections with the change, a lot of the same people still got elected. And that's again partly because people just didn't run for office. So yeah, I mean, and again, I think this also shows the importance, again, of like struggling on the national level for these sorts of things, because in these two instances in Lowell, which we don't think of like immediately in our brain, like where was there segregation or where was there voting rights violations, again, we always think, oh, it happened down there, right? No, it happened here. And the tool to change in Lowell were federal laws and amendments to the Constitution and Supreme Court cases that were fought mostly by African Americans in other parts of the United States. And we disconnect Lowell's history from all of that if we don't really dig in and look at it. And that's just incorrect. Bob, as always, it's always such a great time with you, and I hate how fast our time goes, but I'm excited for our next episode, which I'm going to keep a secret for now. Okay. But we'll dig more into this. Just know we'll be talking more about this topic. We'll be back. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all. This has been History in Lowell.